Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's discussion on negotiating smartly, what you really need to hold on to as a creator, with the wonderful returning expert, Alexia Bedat. Alexia, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks, Amanda. And thanks to the Podcast Academy for having me. Always really fun to do these.
Yeah, and Alexia has done some great clinics, so be sure to check that out, members, into that portal that I mentioned earlier. So, folks, we do have to thank our community building sponsor, Wondery, for underwriting this program. We offer these monthly, as well as other networking opportunities. The Podcast Academy, aka TPA, is a 1,000-strong virtual community across the world, including a lot of the folks in here right now. Members, again, you are very much in the front row. If you have questions or suggestions for other content that we need to be presenting, you know how to find me, education@thepodcastacademy.com. You can also follow us here and stay on top of kind of the programming that we're offering on a monthly cadence. We offer at least 2 to 4 events every month. So another benefit of being a member. And if you're not yet a TPA member, I will email after this a special code for folks to get a sign-up discount that we're offering if you are not a TPA member and you're here with us live. Anyway, it is now time for the main event. I'm going to stop screen sharing. Again, Alexia, thank you so much for being here. And I am excited to see the chat and the questions submitted.
Thanks, Amanda. All right, let me share my screen. I think it's working. Amanda, unless I hear from you otherwise, I'm going to
Looks great.
proceed. Awesome. Well, hi, everybody. It's great to be here. Thanks to the Podcast Academy. My name is Alexia Bedat. I'm an attorney at Klaris. We're a media and entertainment boutique based out of New York City, and work with content creators all over the world. And I particularly work with podcast independent creators, production company, producers, from way at the beginning when you have an idea through to execution, getting your content out there, distribute it, market it. And I actually have to credit somebody who's in attendance here today for the idea for doing this kind of panel, because we were chatting about, it's not easy if you're an independent creator and you come to the table and either you're commissioning somebody to work with you or somebody's commissioning you, the leverage may not necessarily be with you. And so how do you really negotiate smartly as a creator? How do you come to the table asking for things that are actually, on the cards to get, as opposed to digging your heels into positions that are important but may not be realistic on a given deal? So that was sort of the genesis for thinking about this. And we're going to go through a couple of topics here, and I'm really going to try and leave a good amount of time for questions at the end. If I don't get, it's a little bit sometimes distracting to get to them at the same time as presenting. I'll try, but if I don't, I think we'll have a lot of time for Q&A. And I would love to hear from you, because frankly, the legal community is here truly to serve the creative community. And I've heard many times that the thing that gets in the way of getting deals done is the attorneys. So, really curious as to people's experiences, how you've seen deals change over the last few years, stumbling blocks you've come across, discussions you'd like to have. Let's truly make this interactive. So I have to start with so this is me. I'll look at my details at the end as well. The typical disclaimer that the information here is not specific legal advice for you. It's all provided for information, educational purposes. I have to say this, but it's also true. And depending on which side of the negotiating table you're on, some of this may apply to you, some of it may not. So I would really take this more as helpful frameworks to think about and how you approach your negotiations, as opposed to in any way, shape, or form legal advice or gospel. So, a few things to keep in mind. So I'm going to go through 5 different slides of 5 different, what I would say things to keep in mind when you're negotiating a deal and negotiating something smartly. And I'd say, a key question when you walk into a contract is setting your goals. And it's perfectly okay and expected to have different goals depending on each contract, right? So if you've come up with this incredible story or this great idea, and it's your IP and you've been fostering it and developing it for a long time, then retaining your IP may be understandably a really important goal for a given negotiation. But that won't always be the case, right? Maybe you've been developing something and what you really need here, you're happy to grant someone a license, but what you really need is help monetizing and growing your audience, then you're going to go into that negotiation a little bit differently. Maybe you really want to make sure that you're getting production support because you're a small shop or you're collaborating with someone who's got strengths in production that complement yours. So those are really the areas in the contract that you're going to want to focus on. Same for marketing, right? If you're partnering up with a larger entity that has incredible marketing reach, those marketing goals, you want them to be super clearly set out in the agreement. Maybe you're an independent production company that's being hired to produce on a work for hire, meaning that you don't own the IP, you're okay with that. But then all of the language around your production fee and what happens if the commissioning entity terminates for no cause, meaning you haven't done anything wrong, what happens then? You're going to shift your focus much more to that than IP retention because it's their idea and, you don't really care so much about the IP maybe, or you want to make sure that all of your costs, I've seen this happen, really recently, time and time again, where you're an independent production company, you get hired, commissioned to work on something, and through no fault of your own, you get terminated because the commissioning entity either has changed their mind or they've had a shift or they just don't want to proceed with the project or they haven't gotten the funding in turn they need. And what happens then? Are you adequately covered for all of the work you've done to date? Are you covered for all of the contracts you've entered into and the money you've committed to spending? Are you covered for your legal costs to date, right? I mean, it's, I say this as like one of the culprits because I'm an attorney, but you will sometimes have legal fees for a project that doesn't move forward, or even that does, that may exceed or take up way more of the production budget or your production fee than you wanted to. So, if it gets terminated, are at least your legal fees covered? Have you agreed? It can be a little bit uncomfortable before you start a relationship thinking about all of the things that might go wrong. But these are all things that really are very helpful. So think about, like I'd say, one, setting your goals, because rather than just opening a contract or deal terms and, redlining away, some things are going to be okay to accept less favorable terms on because they're just not going to be that important to you on a given project. The other thing is, IP ownership. And I say this, and I know there's going to be eyebrows raised, and but I truly mean it, that IP ownership, and the ownership is in italics for a reason, isn't everything, right? And so I think different lawyers will take different perspectives on this. Different advisors will say it's a bad deal if you don't own your IP. I don't personally think so, because I think IP ownership is only one slice of the IP pie, because somebody can own the IP, but then the rights to distribute, the right to exercise all of the rights that are conferred with IP ownership may actually be held by someone else. The beneficial interest, the economic interest in the IP isn't necessarily 100% held by the person who owns it. So I do think you can get a very good deal, depending again on what your goals were, but you can get a really good deal without owning the IP. And, to just, be real, the fact is most of the time in a negotiation, the person putting up the money is going to have a lot of leverage. And very often the person who's funding a project is going to insist on owning the IP, at least for a period of time, or co-owning it, or having an exclusive license. And sometimes, the IP ownership, you're just going to be barking up the wrong tree, when instead there's a lot of other things, the benefits of IP ownership, you can essentially contract to get them without being the IP owner yourself. So for example, if you're an independent creator or an independent production company and you're being commissioned to work on something, fine. Let's say you're not the owner of the IP. You agree to do a work for hire. But then there's all other kinds of things, you can be asking for. Are you being consulted on how the podcast is actually distributed, right? Because they can own it, but they can still consult you, or, I think approval is often very difficult to get, but you can get consulted on distribution. And that's incredibly important, because if this podcast is distributed widely through an RSS feed with ads, that monetization and long-term, short and long-term revenue looks very different than if this is going exclusively behind a paywall. And that's going to impact the terms you've negotiated as well for compensation, which I'll get you on the second bullet. But, that's something to think about. And especially if you're somebody who, if you bring sort of business acumen to the negotiating table, if you've had successful projects in the past, articulating some meaningful consult right on distribution, may not be impossible. Getting approval on distribution is going to be really difficult, but at the very least, being part of the conversation is important. And this ties to the second bullet point there, which is, fine, you may not own the IP, but are you participating beneficially like an IP owner in the revenue? And what kind of revenues are you talking about here? Are you talking about ad revenue? Are you talking about subscription? What happens if it becomes part of a larger subscription service? How is ad revenue allocated to your podcast? Events, merchandise, licensing. Maybe you've just seen that the terms, it's okay, you get X, 25% of the ad revenue, which great, but what about the other forms of revenue? And if you can build yourself into getting all of it, at least participating like an IP owner beneficially in the revenue, that's also something you've done there. The other things, there's next 3 bullets are about derivatives. And so, the next 2. Also that, right? One of the rights that the owner of the IP has is to authorize derivative works, which means works that are based on the podcast. So films, TV shows, audiobooks, anthologies, a play going on Broadway, all of those things. If those things happen and you're attached to them, both one, you share in the revenue for the rights, because if somebody wants to take your podcast and turn it into a film or a TV show, they're going to acquire the rights or option them. And then also, are you attached to the derivative to render services? So do you get a right to try and be an executive producer or a consultant or a writer? Because the money that you receive there for those services are usually going to be retained just by you. And often, because of how option fees and purchase prices are structured, you may actually make more money through your services deal than the rights. And so again, you may not own the IP, you may not have the exclusive right to initiate derivatives, but have you negotiated that if the person who owns the IP does initiate a derivative, you're attached? Same for future seasons of the podcast, right? If you don't own the IP, you're not the party who gets to decide whether or not to do another season, but have you negotiated what your involvement is going to be if there are additional seasons? Same ownership. Again, we talked about ownership of the podcast, but the RSS feed. Are you being given access to the feed? Could you do a drop? It's very uncommon to get unfettered access to the feed of the person who's, funding the show, because it's their feed, they curate it, it's an asset. But have you negotiated maybe 1 or 2 or 3 drops per year? Are you going to have access to the metrics also to be able to see how your show is performing, how to improve it? And the last bullet, which is important, is even if you don't own it, have you had a conversation about, okay, look, I understand you're funding this, you own it, but what happens if you decide to shelf this forever? I've worked on this, I care about it. Do I have a right to buy it back for your price of your production costs, which are usually plus a premium? Or is it maybe a price to be negotiated in good faith? Does it revert back to me, subject to maybe I pay you the commission or passive revenue? There's all kinds of, it's at the very least worth a discussion, even if you owning the IP isn't an option. What happens if the person who owns the IP doesn't want to pursue the show anymore? And, you may get 1 or 2 or 3 of the bullets here. They might not all be on the table, but when IP ownership is definitely off the table, getting some of the things here are going to bring you that much closer. And if you get all of them, you can essentially contract into all of the benefits of co-ownership. It takes time, but it's not impossible. So that's why I do believe that IP ownership isn't everything, and that it's sometimes a mistake that independent creators or production companies make, is digging their heels in on IP ownership rather than focusing on the other things that are going to be harder for the other side to say no to. And this is somewhat related to another point, what I think is important as part of negotiating smartly, which is threading the needle. And what I mean by threading the needle is, a contract is truly an opportunity to design a relationship. When I started practicing, was sure I wanted to, I'd seen like too many TV shows and Suits and other episodes like that. And I thought going to court was going to be the best, most exciting thing. And the founder of the firm, he's like, just you wait and see, like contracts are actually really cool because you truly get to design the relationship between two people. And he was right. Like I love contracts. And I think also for the people, the creators, this is, unfortunately, the only time you're ever going to open a contract up again is most likely when it goes wrong. And so truly designing and planning for the relationship for what happens when things aren't great, even though it's a bit uncomfortable, like I said before you even start working with someone, to spend time talking about what happens if things don't work out. It's everybody understands. I think you're only more respected for asking about that. So threading the needle and thinking, I put some examples here, but if you don't own the show and they don't want to renew, but you want to renew and you want to do another season, what happens then? Is there any way for it to revert to you? I won't repeat what I just said, but that's kind of what I mean by threading the needle. If this, then what? If maybe you're two co-creators and you co-own a show together, as co-owners, as a matter of law, you essentially, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but you essentially each have all of the rights to do what the copyright owner can, but you have to account to the other side. So I could license the show to someone without my co-owner's permission, but then I would need to account, the profits that I get to my co-owner. Again, I'm simplifying. So if you are co-owners, have you threaded and thought through exactly what that means? Another question is, if this happens a lot where the podcast is based on a book, have you thought about derivatives of both the book and the podcast to make sure you don't have competing derivatives being pitched in the market? Because if somebody's retained the film TV rights to the book and somebody else has the film TV rights to the podcast, you've essentially got potentially, conflicting TV shows being pitched out there. So have you thought about that? Have you threaded the needle there when you've got source IP? And termination, I mentioned at the beginning, super important if you're an independent production company and you're rendering services. You can't often control termination because it's always, almost invariably the party funding the show has the right to say, we're not going to do this show anymore, but then focus on exactly what happens if they do exercise that right. So that's what I mean by thread the needle and thinking these things through. And so that I'm just taking a quick look to see if there's relevant to what we just discussed before moving on to somewhat answer the questions in order. There's a question here about, is it possible you don't own the IP and you still get your name attached to the project through derivative content consistently like created by? So I touched a little bit on this, but yes, absolutely. I think what you're asking here, Fernanda, is what's often referred to as source content, a source credit. So you would say if this gets turned into a film TV show, one of the terms you're going to have there is that it's based on the podcast by X, and that it'll say that in the film and it'll say that in the TV show in the credits. One thing I've noticed is I've watched a few TV shows that are based on podcasts, and the duration of the credit on screen is fleeting. It's super quick. It's not as quick as the credits for the people who've worked on the show. So if you can, that might be something you try and negotiate is, the party you're working with, like you're going to really use your best efforts to make sure that the source credit length and duration on screen and placement is as favorable as, the directed by credit, all of the other credits. But yes, these are all things, your name, you can negotiate. You might also, sort of the opposite. Like if you get, and this, I've also seen this happen, where you get kicked off a project and you don't want your name being attached to something that you haven't completed and you haven't seen it through because you have no control over the quality at that point. So you could negotiate, if you take over, because there's often a clause, it's called a takeover right. If you exercise your takeover rights, but through no fault of my own, essentially you terminate, maybe I have the right to elect not to be credited on the show because I don't stand by the final product. So, you may sometimes really want to be attached, and sometimes you may want to have flexibility as to when your name is or isn't attached. There's another question around any substantive, difference in the IP approach. If it's the podcast is combined with the platform like e-learning. I'm sure there are very specific ones there. I mean, the first things that come to mind, there's going to be probably disclosures there, around educational content. But I mean, the fact that it's going to be on a platform that's for learning in terms of substantively the law, the main thing I think will be different is disclosures around that. And but otherwise, I don't think there's a substantive difference necessarily. But if you have a more specific question on that, because I don't feel like I answered that very well, please drop it in and I'll come back to it. So threading the needle. So what did we say so far, right? We said set your goals. Depending on those goals, maybe IP ownership isn't everything. Threading the needle. So, thinking through if X, then Y. And unpacking the legalese. I put a little cartoon here, which I'm going to say is being fair used for the purposes of this presentation, because I think it illustrates really nicely what I mean. It says, there's a new legal world that came up and they're still working on a definition for it. The, contracts, you as a creator should be able to look at your contract and understand what it says. And sometimes through no fault of your own, that may not be possible because the lawyers are on either side trying to be vague or trying to be unclear because it benefits. And so, unpacking the legalese and the terms and actually understanding is very important. I think a little sort of practical tip is paying very close attention to the definitions. When you're an independent content creator or a production company, the definitions are super important to look at, because once the term is defined and then bolded and then that term is used again, everything that was included in that first definition applies. And so it's a very, I don't want to say sneaky because it's good lawyering, but a robust definition at the beginning, you may be able to get in things there that you haven't made as obvious elsewhere. And so pay attention to the way things are defined, because if, let's say you're a creator and you only want to bring to the table a specific season of a project, look at the definition of the project. Is the project just season 1? Or is the project season 1 and all ancillaries and all derivatives and all sequels and all prequels, i.e. the project? Then every single time the project is used in the agreement, it's catching all of that. So, pay attention to the definitions. And a really good example is net profits. So going back to the first slide, if you've been able to negotiate participating in the revenue, that's great, but that's step 1, because how is that profit actually defined, right? Because if you're getting 50% of net profits, but in that definition of net profits, there's about 1 million things that happen before your 50% kicks in, then maybe your chances of getting your 50% are lower. And so you're going to negotiate a higher fee up front because you don't really know whether you're going to get that 50% ever, right? Because, and it's, the things in there are often customary, but the funding entity is going to get to recoup their cost, potentially at a premium, potentially with overhead, potentially they're taking a distribution fee, potentially they're charging for all the hosting, bandwidth, website, admin fees they need to pay. Potentially there's other third parties that are also getting shares. So maybe you get 50%, but after other third party participation. So if there's another co-host that's been brought in and they've been given it and they're allowed to deduct that before paying you, like paying really close attention to the definition of net profits. 1, maybe you can get a better definition. And if you can't, then like I said, maybe the chances of you seeing profits goes down, in which case maybe your fee up front needs to be negotiated differently. So that's what I mean, like the legalese is 50% of net profit sounds great, but what does net profits actually mean? And if you're like a production company and you need to make sure that your production budget's being funded. I saw this happen recently. There was a question, okay, the production budget's being funded, but there was an overage and it wasn't clear whether the overage, so you went over your budget, whether that was also going to be approved, exactly what as the production company costs are you going to be able to get paid and covered by the buyer. So making very clear that you're clear on that. Like I said before, the termination, right? It's so common. I call this like the boilerplate, all the clauses at the end, which are like clauses 6 through 25, which are around termination, indemnification, representations, and warranties. It's so easy, frankly, even sometimes as an attorney, right? To be tempted to just glaze over those and say, it doesn't matter. But again, it really does, because often those are the clauses that have in there exactly what's going to happen when things go wrong. And as I mentioned before, chances are you open up your agreement when things have gone wrong. So looking there, being really clear, what are you representing and warranting? If you're a production company and you're rendering audio production services, and it says you represent that all of the content you deliver is original, well, wait a second, what do you mean the content I deliver? Because you're giving me scripts that were written by a writer you hired. I've just, I've done, and not just, but I've done the sound design, everything. I've edited it, I've produced it. I'm giving you the mixes. Sure, like the sound elements I'm adding, the special effects are going to be licensed, the music, but I'm not making any representations and warranties that the content itself isn't problematic. Like that's your responsibility with your writer to make sure that that's legally cleared. Or, the flip side, if the expectation is on the production company, then that's a line item, make sure you want in your budget that your legal costs of clearing the content you're delivering are covered. And it's so often it says that you rep and warrant that you deliver everything fully cleared. And that's something I raise all the time, way at the beginning of the deal terms. Who's responsible for legally clearing this? And is the party who's responsible, have they budgeted for that? Because that's, that's not a nice surprise at the end of your, invoicing for your last milestone and you realize that you've got this huge legal fee that hasn't been covered. Again, termination. So again, sort of staying with the example of production fees, like the whole paragraph around termination, it will often say that the commissioning party can terminate at will. And I don't think you're going to get that taken out because that's just industry standard, but you've got a much better chance of saying, okay, well, if you terminate, I get paid my production company fee in full, or I get paid a prorated percentage of my production company fee for the amount of time and services that I've rendered, or there's a kill fee. I mean, there's all different kinds of ways, but making sure that you're not left holding the bag for work or fees, expenses that you've incurred just because you were doing your job properly. And again, this is the last point, but the approval is also one, this is sort of related to, I want to say, threading the needle. Before the last bullet point on unpacking the legalese is, as the party who's delivering, the party commissioning is often going to have approval, right? Because they're putting it out there. They're the party with the deeper pockets. They're the ones who are going to get sued if something goes wrong. So they have to approve and have final approval over what happens. But there's a lot of things to think about there, right? Like if they want to make changes, do you have an opportunity to make the edits first? If they make changes and there's a problem that arises out of the changes they made, is that excluded from what you're liable for? So making sure, like threading the needle between who has final approval and who's responsible for what, and making sure that the person who has final approval is responsible for the things that they have done differently than what you've delivered. That's an example of what I mean by threading the needle. There's a question here in the chat about whether there's ever a time like recording artists. Will there ever be a time like recording artists where podcasters will be paid royalties for their podcasts? So right now, I don't know if you've seen there a lot of lawsuits were brought last year by comedians for their routines the actual literary work and their routines to be compensated, and not just the ownership in the recordings. And, what often happens is it depends what your starting contract is, right? Because if as the podcaster, you've said everything's a work for hire, you assign all the distribution rights, performance rights, even if the script is somehow seen as a literary work that could trigger performance royalties in the same way, you've assigned that right away. There's no sort of statute right now, like with music, that triggers royalties. What's very much done now, as I'm sure the person who has the question is, you might participate in a revenue share. So, I mean, there could be a time where there's a statute. I don't see that happening anytime soon. But you certainly see creators negotiating and asking to participate in the upside of their work, which is, a different way of saying you get paid royalties. But there's no automatic right that says if a clip from your podcast gets played elsewhere, you automatically get a certain amount. There are entities out there that have, I think, I don't want to say the wrong ones, but I think Spoken Giants is an entity that's trying to come up with better royalties. This is for performing artists, but they've talked a little bit about how it could apply to podcasts as well. There's nothing right now. I don't think it's happening anytime soon for podcasts. And I think it's the best way to make sure you get paid royalties or participate in licensing fees is to negotiate that from the get-go in your agreement. And last, but not least, is another tip I would say is asking questions. And so often in negotiating, one side will ask for something, the other side will say no. The other side will then push back and say, no, but yes, this has to be in here. And there's never been really a question of, why did you ask for this? Like, why is it important to you? Or on the flip side, well, why can't you do this? And because sometimes by asking questions, you'll actually get to the bottom of what's driving the ask, and what's driving the ask may not actually be the way that it's formulated in the ask. So for example, if somebody is really holding on IP ownership, if you ask them, well, why do you want to hold on to the IP? And they may say, well, I want to make sure that if anything ever gets, else is done with this IP, that I'm involved. And it's like, okay, well, let's talk about it. We need to own the IP, but if we do a derivative, you'll be attached. If we do another season, you'll be locked to it. You can get to the bottom of it. Or, if you're asking for approvals over distribution and they're saying no, be like, well, why no? Like, what's your plan for distributing this? Are you planning on putting it on a paywall? Okay, well, you might be putting it on a paywall, but this agreement doesn't reflect at all how I get compensated if you do. And, if they say, well, we need to own this and we need to own the film and TV rights to this. Well, it's a legitimate question to ask, okay, fair, but how do you view this as a film TV show? What's your plan for pitching it? Can you point me to different examples in the past where you've successfully done this? Because, if one side is asking to hold film TV rights, but they have no actual plans, no actual output for it, and no experience in it, but actually you do, and you've been talking about it, it might make sense in this specific instance for you to be involved in pitching the derivative. So, and those are conversations you're not going to get if you're just exchanging red lines for the sake of exchanging red lines. And one very small practical tip is, I call it the red line rainbow, but when you're exchanging drafts for several months, because that's the way the podcast industry is a bit quicker than film TV, but things still take time. And then it's like different colors every time in the body of the email. And you look back 2 months later and you have no idea which color was who. I find it really useful to put every single time there's a new color, you put like red equal Sophie, the date, blue equal Mark, the date, yellow equals Sophie, the day, green equals, so you can follow and track what I call the red line rainbow. Anyway, sorry, it's maybe more useful for lawyers, but I still think it's fun. So yeah, other questions you can ask, if they say, well, you can't own it, we need to own it. And you say, okay, well then I need to be locked to season 2 as the host. And they say, no, why? I don't understand why. Like, what interest are you trying to guard, you as the financier, by not locking me to season 2? Because maybe they'll say something and you can understand and you can address it differently. That's the beauty of a contract. There's no set form necessarily, although you'll often have larger places that say it's precedent and we just can't. That's, I mean, like, I can't say I've never said it myself on behalf of a client, but it's, I think, somewhat lazily lawyering and lazy business affairs way of doing things, relying on precedent. Like, it's no divine law that you can't invent new language. But, asking questions and understanding, and you can get even creative, right? You could say, okay, fine, I understand this main agreement never changes, but let's enter into a side letter that amends some of the terms. And I mean, that has worked, by the way, in the past, like entering into a confidential side letter between the parties. You don't mess with the form because it's, a large streamer or platform and they're very rigid with their forms, but you enter into a side letter, could work. So all that to say that teasing out the rationale behind the ask can often help you just break the stalemate and actually get to a path. And I would say I didn't put it here, but one way of asking these questions, I think a way of negotiating smartly is get on a phone call, right? It's so easy to be passive aggressive by email. It's so easy for things to get lost in translation, even when the people's hearts are in the right place. And just breaking through all of that, getting on a phone call, chatting, I think can really be very useful. And so just to go back quickly, as I was saying, just to recap a little bit, a few tips for negotiating smartly. And by that, I just mean, not digging your heels in on one thing, setting your goals. IP ownership is not necessarily everything. How can you get the benefits of IP ownership without the actual ownership? Thread the needle, make sure that you've designed in your contract the relationship so that think of all the different times you're going to need to reopen this contract, and is it clearly set out there? And maybe you don't, right? Maybe it's in your benefit for it to be ambiguous, but then it should be intentional. Unpack the legalese, and last but not least, ask questions. And so with that, I thank you very much for your time and attention, and we'll move to Q&A. I'll turn to the first few that are here, but I would also love to hear, your experiences, stumbling blocks you've seen in negotiations, things that you've seen, have helped negotiations move along or have prevented deals from closing. Would love to hear from you. So I'll take the ones that are here ready now. Can licensing your podcast instead of giving your IP away be an option? Absolutely. So you can license, and that's actually a really good point. So you can say to somebody who's wants to work with you and distribute your show, okay, I'll give you an exclusive license to distribute it for 2 years. Like, I can't do anything else. It's essentially as if you're going to be the copyright holder during the term, but when the term's over, if we don't renew, all of those rights revert back to me. Often that's going to come with some, they're going to say, well, during the term, we invested time, money, effort. If the show goes back to you, we still get some passive tail or some interest. But yes, licensing is going to be important, but be careful with licensing, because if you enter into a deal that says you're licensing it for the life of copyright, it sounds nice that it's a license, but you've really essentially given it away for, for all intents and purposes forever. So yes, licensing is an option, but then the terms of the license, the duration, the scope, exactly what rights are being licensed are important. It's just a lot of places don't want to do that. And for understandable reasons, because as the commissioning entity, just clean ownership of the show allows you in turn to then go and make other deals for distribution, promotion, marketing, tie-ins, everything. And if you're doing a license model, as the buyer, the funder, their concern is going to be, am I getting licensed every single right I need to be able to do all of the things I need? So that's why a lot of places often just prefer to go for ownership than licensing, but it's absolutely an option. There's another question. Am I seeing activity in the audio drama space? Do you mean by that scripted? Do you mean by that like audio stage? Maybe if you can drop a clarification on that. There's all different kinds of audio deal making, but I just want to make sure I answer the question specifically. There's a question about right of first refusal and right of first negotiation. Very important points. what those mean is, it means that a right of first refusal, they're kind of so a right of first negotiation means before you go and do X with the show, I get a certain period of time exclusively to decide to do something. And so it happens often where, let's say you've assigned the IP, you've assigned the rights, you don't own it, you're producing a show, but you tell them, listen, as the production company, even though you, commissioning party, own the show, I, the production company, get a right of first refusal or right of first negotiation to produce additional seasons or to produce audio derivatives. And that means that they're going to have to go to you first before going to somebody else. And then that often comes, the right of first negotiation often comes with a right of last refusal or a matching right, which is they come to you, you can't get to mutually agreeable terms. But if they then go to a third party, they can't agree to less favorable terms with somebody else, or sorry, more favorable terms for them without coming back to you to give you a chance to match. So you often see right of first refusal, right of first negotiations, right of matching rights, where you've given rights away or you don't have the rights to start, but you're asking the other side to come to you first for something. If there's something more specific on that you wanted to talk about, please feel free to drop a follow-up question, but that's essentially what those are.
Alexia, I got clarification from Patrick that
Great.
it's scripted audio. I just wanted to raise that to you when you're ready to move on to that question. Sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. Thank you. I didn't see that because it didn't come up in the questions. Yes, so definitely seeing a lot of that. Also with, there's going to be with like Atmos and different sound design and new sound improvements, a lot of that really lends itself to scripted podcasts and scripted shows. So you do see a lot of those. And it can also be a really, to produce a scripted podcast, while it's expensive to produce a high quality scripted show, it remains to date less expensive than producing a scripted TV show. And so you often see, often a podcast can be used sort of a little bit as testing ground for, I don't mean like, it should always be audio first and work as audio, but you do often see, and you see there are production companies out there who are very open that their business model is to, funnel IP to film, TV, and they create productions to start with that sound great in audio, but very much with a mind to derivative IP. But yes, there's definitely, there is activity in the audio drama space. It's can be a little bit more difficult to monetize sometimes in terms of advertising than the typical talk show or the things like that. So you tend to see it maybe more with places that have deals with platforms where they're going to live behind a paywall or like that. But yes, you still see scripted work. And I've been, seeing a little bit more of that, and especially often as a companion to TV shows. So maybe like a platform is going to invest a lot of money in a TV show, and at the same time, they're going to do like a companion scripted pod with the TV show. Another question about the kinds of lawyer you should be looking to ask all these questions and review these contracts. Is there various types of people who address it, or is it a specialty? So it's a good question, because there's the idea of entertainment lawyers generally, and it's not like there are podcast laws that are different than, something else. It's more, I think, working with an attorney who understands the way the business works, that understands, okay, well, this is, you're getting the rights now, you're saying it's going to go wide now, but what happens if you license it? That sort of understand the life cycle of a podcast and how it's going to live in the ecosystem and what things are going on. And oh, now there's more people putting their shows on YouTube, so we also need to have the rights to have audiovisual content with the audio. So I would just get on a call with them and get a sense of how much podcast work they've done and whether you get a good vibe from them. But, I'd say somebody who, and you'll see like more and more websites, honestly, are putting in the last few years, podcast and audio as a subset of areas of specialty in their websites. So if they have that, that's probably an indication that they do it. but I still think at the end of the day, a lawyer has to be someone you have a good gut feeling with and that you feel is going to have your back for what you need, both in terms of the contract and be there like a quarterback and advise you. So I'd say like you look for entertainment lawyers that have specific entertainment lawyers that have experience in the podcast space. Another question that is, if you work within a production podcast company, that what you, I think what is meant here as an employee, that whatever you're working and you develop inside the company is owned by the company. Have you seen it possible to renegotiate for specific projects that you began developing? So for example, let's say what I think this question's getting at is if you're an executive producer or a producer within a production company and you pitch to the production company a show, unless you've agreed otherwise, since you're an employee, everything you've done is work for hire and your production company is going to own that. Do you see different situations? Yes, I have seen production companies do side letters to their employment agreements with their employees on a specific project. But it has to be negotiated because the base position, if you're an employee, is that everything is a work for hire for your employer. So it's possible. I think it depends what the internal policies of the production company are and how they want to, you know, I won't speak for, I don't run a production company, but I think I'll leave it at that yes, it's possible. And you just have to negotiate it if there's a will, right? Another question, if you're doing nonfiction documentary, what are some of the basic questions you need to ask when it comes to telling someone else's story or someone else is the subject of your doc nonfiction project, telling their story right? So this goes to, and I'm super happy to answer this goes to the content as opposed to like the deal making. It's somewhat related to the deal making because like who's responsible for making the right decisions on this? But essentially, I mean, I could go on for a long time on this, but in a nutshell, nobody controls the rights to their own story, right? Because if you did, you would never have documentaries made, the Social Network movie wouldn't have happened, all kinds of, movies don't happen like that because you don't control how history is written about you. So you don't need, like in terms of like myth busting, you don't need to go get someone's life rights to do a documentary about them, to do a film about them. The reason that sometimes people do is because one, it makes, it's a way of assuring that the person is not going to complain about the fact that you've done it, even though they may not have a valid claim, but they can still make your life difficult. And two, it's often to make sure they're working exclusively with you so that you haven't spent 2 years developing a podcast on this great story. And then a month before you see like another production company beats you to the punch and released it with the participation of the subject. So it's often for that, right? It's you get life rights to get exclusivity and to at least try and get a release of claims. But so I'd say like step one, you don't need to get life rights. But then what's really important is if you're talking about somebody real who's alive, you could potentially defame them and you can say something about them that's not true. And that if it's not true would, hurt their reputation. So if you are, the basic questions I think you need to ask when it comes to telling someone else's story is, have you gotten your facts right? Have you gotten, what's the level of reporting you're doing? What are your sources? Having a very clear record of that and all of that being very clear, because when you then produce it and deliver it to, the commissioning entity and they want it to be fully cleared, they're often going to want to have a lawyer that's worked with you on it. And that's one of the first things the lawyer is going to ask you is, what's your source for this? What's the record for this? So having all of that very clearly documented when you start building out and reporting your story. And the other thing to think about when you're telling someone else's story is if you don't have a deal with them, there may be some limitations in terms of how you position it, because you can't position it as like the authorized story. You're going to have to be careful. And while people don't control how their story's told, they do control their use of their name and likeness for advertising purposes. So you're going to have to think carefully about like using, the use of their image and in the advertising and the projects. I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm just saying you want to think more carefully about it. So there's a lot of that. Also, it's like how you're going to market it, how you're going to position it. tons of other questions there. I'm super happy to follow up on that separately if you have more questions on that. Jacob, hi. Question. Yes, so dates is really important. I mean, having a very clear production schedule for the production company. So there's always going to be a production schedule in there. And I think from the production company's perspective, it's very important for it to be very clear. Like, this is how long we estimate it to be. If it goes over through no fault of our own, then, we're going to be paid a prorated monthly additional part of the production budget or our production fee. Like, you don't want to be in a position where you're endlessly being asked to continue producing, and being careful also with the commissioning entity often has like unlimited options to renew, which means that contractually they have the right to come to you and say, hey, we want to do season 2. Are you ready? And they have the contractual right to do that. And they could, I mean, the chances of them doing it is low, but they could hold you in breach for being like, sorry, we don't have the bandwidth to work on season 2 right now. Like, you should have told us earlier. So having clarity, like when options need to be exercised, all of that is important. So yes, around timelines. And the commissioning entity is always going to want to have as vague and broad language. So it's really going to be on you. You're unlikely as the production company to receive a production services agreement that has a super clear timeline. So it's going to be on you to make sure that it's very clear for you as the production company, when your services are expected to end, what happens if there's delays not caused by you, when they have to exercise their rights to order more, how many rounds of edits they get. That's often another thing that's not in there, like how many rounds of edits, because like you have to deliver something to their satisfaction. But 1, how many rounds of edits does your budget include? And 2, by when do they need to give you feedback? And 3, when is something actually considered approved to trigger payments to you? All of those things are highly unlikely to be in the draft that the commissioning entity sends you. So it's going to be on you to put all those things in and to look out for those. Danny, great to see you too. I think I've gone through all of the questions, which if there's anything else, please jot them in, or if you want to follow up on a specific project on the side, and I'll turn it over to Amanda so we can wrap in time. And thanks again to all of you and to the Podcast Academy.
Thank you so much, Alexia. It was just really always, we get so much out of these talks. Folks, this is a really good example of the type of programming that we offer at least twice, usually more often, a month. And we had a lot of great questions. But as I mentioned in the chat, folks can continue the conversation if they're a member of a TPA on the TPA Slack members only channel for general questions. Again, Alexia, it's just been a pleasure. Folks who are members, you can also see Alexia's past talks. She's you have, Alexia, facilitated a panel on international considerations for business dealings across the pond, if you will. And then also you did a really great primer on IP, I believe, last year. So folks can watch those on demand. If you are a TPA member, you can log in. TPA members, you will be able to access this by going into the member website and checking out the recorded events and other things like that we've offered in the past through the resources page. I'm going to, again, invite everybody to share shout outs and gratitude to Alexia as well on this area. I'm going to put in the chat shortly whenever I can find that. But in the meantime, it's been really wonderful. We do hope you all can sign up and join TPA. We have a really exciting year ahead. We also are in Ambi's season. Again, if you're watching this in 2023, September 13th, which is when we're broadcasting this, the early bird pricing ends in 2 days, and then the rates will go up slightly. And then further, you have until November 17th to submit your or your client's podcast projects for consideration. So that's another really exciting thing that TPA is overseeing. Folks, it's been fantastic. Again, I want to thank you so much, Alexia. Any parting words before we wrap this up?
No, thanks for being such an engaged audience, and thanks for doing all the great work you do. It's a pleasure to get to work with people like you.
Fantastic. All right. Well, the last thing I want to plug here is we have a really great collaboration with the Women's Media Group. You do not have to identify as femme, non-binary, or female, but it's a really great lunch and learn. There is a small fee, and TPA members get a discount if they want to attend. So again, that information is in the TPA members web portal. I'm going to stop sharing and thank all of our people who are watching this on demand after the event for watching us. And Alexia, it's been great. I'm going to stop recording.